John, thank you for coming a bit early.
My pleasure.
Because my other guests apparently didn't show up, so you are
perfect. Oh, that sounds
time.
familiar.
How you doing today, man? You doing all right?
I'm okay, thanks. How are you?
I am doing great. John, you're easily one of my favorite people to talk to.
Oh, thank you.
You have led such a colorful, interesting, at times painful life. But nevertheless, it has led to, like I said, colorful life. The reason I brought you in, I've been focused on what has been taking place in Syria, where Turkey, the US, even Israel have put money, resources in having jihadists reignite, come out of Idlib screaming with a full-blown military of terrorists. I'm sorry, freedom-loving terrorists.
Freedom fighters.
Yeah, freedom-loving, right. Freedom-fighting terrorists who are chopping off heads as they go along. And we back this stuff. We pay for this stuff. I mean, these guys are driving in American armaments, weapons like tanks and whatnot. Why? Go back for us into the way that the CIA has ingratiated itself into these Al Qaeda groups in order to get these groups to fight for America. And how is this even done? Like, meaning, how does the CIA get in contact with a terrorist? Like, who are they even talking to in order to get their hands on it? Is this just going through Turkey and Turkey talks to the terrorists? How does this work in practice?
Yeah, in part. There are several different ways to do it. And this is we should preface this, Jamal, by saying this is a very complicated situation. But the easy part is that the United States is wrong. So let's talk about that. The way you get in touch with a terrorist group is multifold. Number one, you go through the Turks. Number two, you might have a recruited asset that you then send to the leadership. Number three, maybe you've captured some of these guys and you sit down and you say, look, here's our position. And then you lay it out that you want to actually cooperate, work, finance, arm their organization. So there's several different ways to do it. Now, I said it was complicated for a number of reasons. Number one, the United States does not have any genuine national interests in this fight, right? I mean, let's just call a spade here. Syria doesn't have any appreciable amount of oil. Number one.
I am going to quibble with that just a little bit. From the U.S. perspective, I think we're looking at this as a global conflict. And these are just fronts. Like if we were in the Second World War.
But we shouldn't, though. But we shouldn't look at this as a global conflict, is my point. Number one, you know what? Let me tell you a very quick little story. In 2000, my two oldest sons wanted me to take them to Madison Square Garden to see a WWE professional wrestling match. So I took them. I hated it. I didn't understand any of it. And I said to them finally about 15 minutes in, I don't get it. Which one's the good guy? And my oldest son said, that's just it, Dad. There is no good guy. And that's the situation in Syria. There is no good guy. Now, with that said, whether you like his politics or not, whether you believe that he has killed his own people or not, with gas or chemicals or whatever, and there are serious doubts that he ever did, Bashar al-Assad is the only thing standing in the way of the complete and total annihilation of Syria's quite large Christian community. All right, there are Christians in the parliament, there are Christians in the cabinet, in senior positions, including the foreign minister. And if Bashar al-Assad is overthrown by these jihadi radicals, every Christian in Syria is either going to be executed or forced out of the country. So the decision that the United States has made is, this is a black and white issue. We don't like Assad. Assad is with the Russians. We're with the Kurds. The Turks are against the Kurds. The Kurds don't have the manpower to take over the whole country, but ISIS does. So we're going to ally ourselves with ISIS Light, which is the Islamic rebels, formerly known as the Al-Nusra Front, which before that was known as Al-Qaeda. Now, can you imagine? We've allied ourselves with Al-Qaeda. Now, they have promised us that they would moderate their politics. They haven't, but they have gladly accepted American weapons, American
They're still chopping off
ammunition.
heads, John.
They're
I'm
still
sorry.
chopping off heads.
Yeah.
Exactly. But this is what we've done because we don't like Assad and we don't like the fact that the Russians are in Syria propping up Assad. That's really what it comes down to.
And it's just astonishing to me. At some point you realize you're not the good guys. And this is one of those moments where we're just not good guys. I mean, it's amazing to me that we're willing to do this just to take down Assad. And do you think this is being provoked because of what's happening in Ukraine? Like they're effectively losing so poorly in Ukraine that they've expanded the battlefield out to Syria.
Yes, I do. I do. Very, very much so. I was having a conversation with a friend about this just yesterday. And he said, you know, one of the interesting things is that there is literally no leadership in the West right now. The American president is weak. The Canadian prime minister is weak. The British prime minister is falling on his face. The French government just collapsed yesterday.
Yeah.
The German government is in the process of collapsing. There's just no leadership in the West. And so what happens in a situation like that is that the US government flails around looking for a quick and easy war in which it can make an impact and come out looking more strongly.
Mm-hmm.
Syria is not the way to do that. But in Washington, nobody seems to either understand or to care.
But why do they think that, though? I mean, like, for example, and let me get your take on this. When you would think, or at the very least in the old days, that there was a strategic overarching plan when they're looking at the world and looking at the globe. That doesn't seem to be the case here. It seems like they sleptwalked into Syria thinking, well, we're the West, we have economic and military domain, so we can tell the Russians that we can totally win this fight in Ukraine. There didn't seem to be any planning on it. They seem to just fell ass backwards into it.
Well, let me interrupt you. It's akin to the Russian position during the Vietnam War, where the Russians didn't want to get directly involved. So they just armed the North Vietnamese, did it over the course of years, and finally the Americans were driven out. The American calculus is the same in Ukraine. We're not going to get directly involved. We're not going to have American troops fighting Russian troops, but we'll arm the Ukrainians to their eyeballs and just hope that they can bleed the Russians, even if it takes 20 years, and then force the Russians out. And that's actually not the way it's working out.
Yeah, that failed miserably. That didn't happen that way at all. And it seems like they've staked this idea, the reason why I quibble with this idea that it wasn't in our interest in Syria is because it seems that they're looking at this as existential from the standpoint of Western control. Like if they lose in Ukraine, then the very purpose of NATO, the very purpose of this notion of Western controlled world also falls, dies with it. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong on that, because they have escalated over and over and over again, and they don't seem to be able to accept the fact Ukraine is a loss. They just don't seem to be able to do it.
Well, because if Ukraine is a loss, then what happens to the post-war planning? I mean, the notion that you declare Ukraine a major non-NATO ally goes out the window. Ukraine can't join NATO as an official member. Ukraine probably then can't join the European Union, although there's a precedent for that in Cyprus. But if the Ukrainians lose this conflict, it really screws things up for the Americans. And then what do? There's no plan. There's no post-war plan for what happens if Ukraine loses.
Wow. The CIA, when it's dealing with, I would imagine, so one of the things that Seymour Hersh pointed out was that during the Bush administration, that there was a turn with this idea that, okay, in order for us to get Iran, we need to get Syria. And so back during the George Bush administration, they started working with terrorist organizations to try to make connections with those organizations with the idea of creating a resistance against Assad, or for that matter, even his dad at one point, to try to either overthrow to undercut him with the idea of moving into Iran. Now, this goes back to Wesley Clark saying that the U.S. government was trying to take down 7 governments in 5 years, which is, again, astonishing when you really think about it. I mean, the number of lives that they were willing to basically kill in order to pull this policy over with. I remember a conversation with you where you told me how you were sitting at a meeting and Dick Cheney pointed out they were going to try to go through all of those countries into Iran. That seems to be what they're doing, and it seems to be what they're still doing now. Correct me if I'm wrong, though.
No, I think that, well, the Pentagon, the CIA, the State Department, they have these on the shelf or off the shelf policies, right? Mm-hmm. So we've got a policy that's just sitting there on the shelf to invade Iran and to overthrow the government. But it's not just Iran specific. We have off the shelf plans for 24 countries like that. Just in the event that all hell breaks loose, or we see or there's an uprising in Iran, we can move in and take advantage of it. What you're talking about is a meeting that I was in the night before we invaded Iraq. And it was General Tommy Franks, who was the commander of Central Command in Tampa, giving his final pre-attack briefing, in which he said that we're going to cross the border in the morning, and if all goes as planned, he said, we can be in Tehran by August. This was the end of February 2003. Of course, that didn't happen because there's a fundamental misunderstanding of the Middle East, and as we've come to learn, of other countries around the world, where we're not greeted as liberators. We're greeted as invaders and occupiers. And so we're resisted. They're not going to throw flowers at us, which is what one of the senior directors at the National Security Council said in that meeting. When we cross the border, they're going to throw flowers at us. No, they're not. They're going to throw hand grenades at us to try to stop us from invading and occupying their country. Mm-hmm. So it's the same situation now. Yeah, I made a point on a show the other day, and I'm going to stick by it. The Iranians hate Donald Trump. Donald Trump hates the Iranians. Donald Trump murdered Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Al-Quds force. And there's a very special kind of hatred of Donald Trump in Iran. With that said, there are credible reports that Elon Musk met with the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations 2 weeks ago.
Now, do you believe that? Because Iran said that didn't happen.
I do. 100%. I do. Okay. You can't hide a meeting like that.
So they're denying it for public consumption, not...
Absolutely.
Okay.
And the reason I think that it happened is because you remember the old phrase, only Nixon could go to China.
Right.
Right? Richard Nixon had spent his entire adult life attacking Chinese communism. And then it was Nixon that went to China and made peace with the Chinese and established diplomatic relations with the Chinese. Only Trump could go to Iran. And I think something may be afoot, at least in the very preliminary stages, where, maybe we've underestimated Trump, or maybe his domestic craziness has influenced us to the point where we just dismiss everything that he does. Maybe there's something to this.
Even with this radically pro-Israel contingent of lunatics that he's bringing into his administration, even with them, you think that he may be...
But what makes them any less radically pro-Israel lunatic than what the Biden administration has given us?
Hegeseth, one of those people believing that Christ is going to return in the middle of a war in the Middle East.
Right. Yeah.
And if you could provoke that war and build a temple on the mound, that Jesus returns.
Correct.
What that looks like in regards to policy, I agree with you, may not necessarily be that different in the way it's expressed. But that is pretty damn outrageous. And it's like, if these are the people that he's bringing into his administration, that gives me concerns in regards to
but it was the same kind of people that were in the Reagan administration and the George W. Bush administration. We cycle through these evangelical lunatics every time there's a Republican administration. Nothing comes of it. This is a very long-standing evangelical position, that you've got to support the Israelis because you've got to support a policy that that demands that all Jews return to Israel, because only then can Jesus come back, and it's the apocalypse and blah, 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 and then the rapture, and then everybody that's good goes to heaven. It's all nuts.
Yeah.
And not biblically based, by the way.
They believe it, though.
The word rapture never appears in the Bible anywhere. It's made up. It's a late 19th century invention of American Baptists. Even European Baptists don't believe in the rapture.
Interesting. I'm curious from your take, how is the CIA involved in all of this stuff? Like, meaning...
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. This is one of those situations, Jamal, where the CIA does as it's told. Remember, the CIA is a...
What is it told to?
The CIA is not a policy agency; it's a policy support agency. And so, if the policy coming out of the White House is that the CIA should, make nice with Al Qaeda or with ISIS, then they make nice with Al Qaeda or ISIS. If the position of the White House is that it works along with the government of Turkey to encourage Islamic radicals to take Idlib and Hama,
that's what it does.
Then that's what it does. Yeah, it does.
How are they paid? Like, meaning, when the CIA goes to some of these groups, thick beards, warriors of Allah that are free democracy-loving terrorists.
Yes.
At some point, they're getting paid. They're driving around in military Humvees. They're carrying, these special weapons. They're getting training from the Ukrainians in regards to drone warfare. I mean, like, this is a full, like, hundreds of thousands of thick bearded men going into war. How on earth does the CIA get money appropriated from Congress to give? And
no. Oh, no. Let me, I'll correct that first and then answer your question more specifically. The black budget is never delineated. The appropriations are never delineated. It's just a number. And then once the number is approved by Congress, the CIA spends it in any way they want. So there's no line item that says...
No, there's no oversight at all to this?
The Gang of Four, the chairman and vice chairman of the two oversight committees will have access to the information, but even the other members of the committee won't have access to the information.
Just the number.
Just the number.
So the CIA says, I need $1 trillion. And they say, okay, here's it.
Okay.
Here you go.
All right. And then they'll whisper into the ears of the chairman and the vice chairman of the House and Senate committees what the number's for. And then they just go like this. So, number one. Number two, I'm fond of saying, I've been saying for 20 years, 30 years, intelligence is a cash business. I'm not joking with you tomorrow when I say we were throwing money out of the side of helicopters in Afghanistan. I drove from Islamabad to Lahore in 2002 with $2 million in cash in duffel bags.
Are you serious?
I did indeed. Yeah, it's a cash business. You deal in cash. Now it's changing where you can deal in Bitcoin. Nobody's tracing Bitcoin. It's not possible to trace Bitcoin. You just hand somebody a thumb drive, a digital wallet, and you say, knock yourselves out. It's that easy.
Oh, John, that is, I mean, I guess that's how it would have to be on some level, right? Otherwise, you can trace it.
Exactly.
But it is a little disturbing. Somebody is taking duffel bags of money and say, all right, here you are. Now you're well paid. Go buy this gun. Go buy this.
Well, listen, when we thought we had identified the location of Abu Zubaydah, we knew that this was going to be a big and expensive operation. And so I put out a cable region wide and I said, I need $10 million in cash. And so one station sent $1 million, a small station sent 200,000, another station sent 2 million. It was all in cash. And it's flying in diplomatic pouches. And I put it all in a duffel bag. And then I drove with a colleague to to Lahore. And we started buying real estate. We bought 2 houses to use as safe houses and interrogation centers. We're throwing money at, Al-Qaeda people to rat out their colleagues. We're buying guns and battering rams and ammunition and satellite dishes and night vision goggles. And, that's just the nature of the job.
And so when we were working with Turkey, for example, at that point, Turkey takes this expense. And
Turkey will take this expense. We will reimburse them every cent.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm sorry. I just got to hit my, I was just wrapping my head around that. Like, there's so much money that is just sloshing around in cash that is paying people for disreputable actions. All right. So they call out, there's a number that comes up, even though they don't exactly know what the number is for. Congress has to pay money for that. That money is effectively given in cash, and that cash is spread around to whoever is going to be involved in the operation. All right. So then at that point, though, how does the CIA get them to do X or Y? I guess this point, this is a conversation with Turkey. Turkey is an intermediary on this, with Erdogan having his own objectives.
The objectives have to coincide. The national interests have to coincide. The Turks have to want exactly the same thing that the Americans want. Because if they don't, it's not going to work, and you're going to have to go it alone.
But in this case, they do.
In this case, yes, the national interests are identical. Not to say that it's the right thing to do, but the national interests are identical. We hate Assad. The Turks hate Assad. Here's a chance for us to overthrow Assad. Now again, if you're an Israeli, I think the Israelis are making a serious mistake here.
Well, they just want chaos. They just want
they want chaos.
Yeah, which, they just want fighting each other.
Which over the course of a couple of weeks might be a good thing if you're Israeli, because it'll distract the bad guys while they fight each other. But the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And Assad has never been a threat to Israel. Never. But what happens if ISIS is in charge in Damascus?
That's what I was going to say. If the government falls, meaning if all of these people, if the U.S., if the Turks, if the Israelis get what they want, and Assad falls, and you get this caliphate over all of Syria, where all of the Christians are killed, all of the other groups, Muslim groups that they don't like are killed, are beheaded, then what?
Exactly. You know, I've been to Damascus. I don't know if you ever have been, but I was able to go to a working synagogue in Damascus, right? There's a community of Syrian Jews. They are perfectly free to practice their faith as they see fit. They're loyal to the Assad government because it respects freedom of religion, believe it or not.
Safe. Yeah.
It keeps them safe. There are churches all over Syria. I went to Sunday liturgy at a Greek Orthodox cathedral in Damascus. There are Catholic churches in Damascus. Well, if Assad's overthrown, everybody's dead. And they're going to bulldoze. These ISIS and Al-Qaeda people are going to bulldoze the churches. They're going to bulldoze the synagogues. Everybody's either going to be killed or driven out of the country. And then what are the Israelis going to do when they've got an Al-Qaeda or ISIS-led government right on their border?
I know, but Al-Qaeda never attacked Israel.
Because it's never had the ability to. Remember, it killed Jews in India in the Mumbai attacks back in, what was it, 2008, I guess. But they never had proximity to Israel to attack Israel. If they're right on the border, you know, the sky's the limit.
Is the thinking that, okay, well, we can't militarily attack Assad. We can't create a justification for the U.S. or anybody else to attack Assad in that way. However, jihadists, head choppers, they're fair game.
Sure.
We can attack them, and the new government that we put into place will be a patsy and an ally of the U.S., Israel, and be antagonistic to Russia. Is that the thought?
That is the thought.
Okay.
And the Nusra Front, now called the Jabhat
HTS or something.
Yeah, Hayat Ansar, I forget now. Whatever they're calling themselves today.
Keep changing these names.
They have a policy of promoting the notion that they are moderates. They're not moderates, right? They're head choppers, as you say.
They're head choppers.
But they have successfully convinced the United States, or maybe the United States wants to believe that they're moderates, so that as we arm them and finance them, we can sleep at night.
But then they know that's not true. I mean, like, I don't believe for a moment that the U.S. I think I think these people are sociopaths, meaning many in the U.S. They have to know.
Yes, they do.
They have to know.
They know, but at the same time, they think that they are so smart and so good that when Assad's overthrown, they can successfully convince these radicals to truly moderate and work with us in the international community. And remember, there's a bigger fight here. This is the Americans versus the Russians. It just happens to be in Syria.
Yeah, it's just another front in this kind of conflict. Is there an open line between the Russians and the U.S. in Syria?
No, not in Syria specifically. There is an open line from the Pentagon to the Russian Ministry of Defense. But Ambassador Antonov, the recently departed ambassador to the United States, said that it's essentially defunct. There's no communication.
That's so dangerous. So I went to the Putin-Biden summit. I was covering that for the network. And I remember being, I guess at this point, naive and somewhat optimistic, because it seems at the time that Joe Biden and Putin were saying the same thing. Like they were like literally, and the press was attacking Joe Biden because of it. Like, what do you mean you didn't read him the Riot Act? You know, this type of stuff. Yeah. And Biden starts screaming at a reporter at one point saying, you don't understand. Trying to get across to the reporter, look, we're dealing with nuclear powers here. We need to have some level of communication in order to know what each other is doing so we don't necessarily make any mistakes in our, like, that we don't mispredict what the other one is doing. Okay, well, that's out the window now, correct?
Yeah, it's out the window. There's no negotiation. There's no communication. There's no hope for any kind of forward progress in bilateral relations. It's just not happening.
What about through the back door? What about William Burns? Give me your take on Burns. Burns seemed to be a better diplomat than Antony Blinken.
Oh, yeah. There's no comparison. I know both Bill Burns and Tony Blinken. I've known Tony Blinken for years, actually. Not well. We're not buddies or anything, but I've known him for a very long time.
He seems like a lunatic.
No. He's a lovely guy. He's just
Blinken?
Completely over his head. Oh, yeah, he's a lovely guy.
Blinken just came out and said you need to send your kids to a losing war.
Yeah. Well, because that's his job. He's the Secretary of State. He has to promote the policy. But Tony's a very bright, Harvard-educated bureaucrat. But Tony's first job out of Harvard was as a junior legislative aide to Joe Biden. He worked his way up through the Biden Senate office. Yeah. Then he became the legislative director for Joe Biden. Then when Biden became the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Tony became the staff director. When Biden was elected vice president, Tony became his national security advisor. Then Biden had Tony installed as the deputy secretary of state. And then when Biden was elected president, Tony became the secretary of state. So he literally every job he's had in his adult life since he graduated from college was with Joe Biden.
Wow.
Yeah, he's never really lived in the real world. Bill Burns, on the other hand, Bill Burns is the consummate diplomat.
Yeah.
Burns is one of these guys that was respected across party lines at the State Department, the CIA, the Defense Department, the White House. I wrote an op-ed when Burns was first named CIA director saying, finally, an adult in the room.
I saw that. I read that, I think.
Yeah. But it says a lot when you've got these extraordinarily sensitive negotiations between Hamas and the Israelis, where you don't send your Secretary of State.
Exactly.
You send your CIA director to conduct diplomacy. That says a lot about Tony Blinken, as much about Tony Blinken as it says about Bill Burns.
Tell me something else. Tell the audience something about the CIA that they don't know that they'd be surprised about.
I think there's a lot that people would be surprised about the CIA. You know, it's a group of tens of thousands of very, very bright, very patriotic people who are infected by the disease called groupthink. Mm-hmm. And they end up analyzing policy in this little tiny box. So even though these are some of the smartest people that our country can offer, they don't offer the smartest analysis. They don't influence policy the way that they probably might be able to. Mm-hmm. And you know, that old German adage that I was just following orders is really the mantra at the CIA.
Really?
Yeah.
And so
may I add one thing, Jamaro?
Please.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No.
This is why I have always opposed military officers as heads of the CIA, because you become a 4-star general by saying, yes, sir. Right? That's how you make it through your career.
That's your job,
yes, sir. Right. You need a CIA director who has the balls to stand up and say, Mr. President, let me tell you why that is a terrible idea. And we don't have CIA directors like that.
Policy trumps intelligence under normal circumstances.
Yeah.
Wow. John, man, thank you for this. I'm always fascinated by these conversations. Just to
it's my pleasure.
Like the idea that people sitting in a room and come up with, yeah, we're going to get all these people killed because of policy.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem to register. Like, hey, you're getting people killed. Like
we don't learn our lessons from history. You know, John Kerry famously said in 1972, do you want to be, or to paraphrase John Kerry, do you want to be the person who sends his son to die, for a lost cause at the end of the Vietnam War? And here we are decades later. We've not learned that lesson.
Doing the same thing.
To die for a mistake.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's just astonishing. John, man, thank you for this. John Kiriakou.
My pleasure.
He is a former CIA officer. John, where are you now? Where can people find you now?
Substack. Everything I do, I put on Substack, and I am very soon in January going to begin a 50 event 90-day speaking tour of the United Kingdom.
Are you?
Yeah, starting with 4 dates in Ireland, January 31st in Belfast, February 1st in Dublin, February 3rd in Waterford, and February 4th in Cork. And then I go to 5 nights in London.
Now, what is the conversation going to be on?
It's a conversation with CIA officer John Kiriakou. So we can talk about anything people want to talk about.
Oh, that is fantastic. John.
It's all on Substack. Thank you.
Thank you, man. I appreciate this. All right. We have come